Welcome to Close Up van ENTR.
Thank you.
Welcome to Rotterdam, of course. Excited to have you here. Tell me about yourself. Why are we here? Why did we invite you to this show?
Why did you invite me?
Good question.
Currently, I'm the managing director for the Are We Europe Foundation. I'm a journalist, a multimedia creator, and also trends specialist. And I'm here to talk about the future of European media and journalism.
Can you tell me a bit about yourself and how you ended up where you're now, in Berlin, directing Are We Europe, working as a data journalist? How did that come about? Well, it all started with the privilege of being born in London. I am a child of immigrants, and I grew up in a very, immigrant neighborhood in an immigrant city. And so I was lucky enough to feel like really have access to the whole world, and it's really the kind of space that I've always held on to. I studied trend prediction and forecasting, which was a new degree and doesn't exist anymore actually, which was a combination of cultural anthropology and sociology. And my interest was always in people and the ways in which people behave and the kind of cultural differences and similarities that they have. And I always loved journalism, but I didn't really know how to get there. I don't come from the kind of background in which would have put me in those spaces. But I think, before anything, I'm a Londoner, and so I learned very quickly how to be quite scrappy and put myself in the kinds of spaces that I probably had no business being in. And so I think that kind of mixture of, I would say my mother was more of an operations person, and my father was a chef, and Moroccan culture is very much about kind of hustling and finding your way. And Iranian culture is very much about this sort of kind of taarruf, which is a very democratic, diplomatic, gracious way of connecting with people. And so I very much had the kind of operational hustle of my mother's side and the kind of more diplomatic, creative, hospitality culture of my father's side, and then grew up in London, as a child of immigrants with lots of people who were also children of immigrants, at least at the time. And this kind of very scrappy sort of self-starter style thing. And I've always been interested in, arts and design. And actually very early on, I thought I wanted to be in politics. And so I studied politics and English literature and French, and at the time just thought, oh God, this is so dull, and I just wanted the creativity of arts, and I ended up ditching all of that and going down this route. And I chose both of my degrees, my first degree in trend prediction and forecasting because it was in an art school, and I chose my master's degree, which I was lucky enough to get a scholarship for, because it was also in an art school, not because I wanted to write about art necessarily, but because I wanted to always continue to see my work as an artistic practice in its own right. And by the time I sort of graduated, I had already kind of figured out lots of different ways of, being able to do things, whether that was, interning at like a laser printing company or getting a job as a makeshift jewelry designer for Oxfam or all kinds of things. And I think that kind of diversity of experience has always been my shtick. And I didn't, that was probably the first sign that I had ADHD, but nobody really noticed until much later. But I think there were two core things about my childhood which really framed that for me. One, I grew up in a very multilingual home, and it wasn't until I got to school that something happened, and I ended up not speaking to anybody for 6 years. And I remember my mother was taking me to a psychiatrist every week, and the school were really worried, and it just lasted so long, and nobody really understood what was happening. And they had said to my parents, hey, it's because you've been speaking so many languages at home, please speak English. And that sort of framework for the way that they tried to solve that was, I think, my first very clear experience of prejudice and racism towards these kind of more, mixed households. And my mother always finds it very funny now because I never stop talking. But I think during that time, it really taught me how to listen. And as a journalist, despite the fact that we are always talking, when you are in those very intimate settings with interviewees, you know, sometimes you might have 10 minutes and someone has to tell you the most traumatic thing that's happened in their life. You really learn to listen and be present. And it wasn't until, sort of much later, I came across this video on the BBC about this young girl who had this thing called selective mutism. And I was like, that's what I had. But they didn't really know. And so they framed it under this sort of idea. And actually it was much more connected to my neurodiversity. But, you know, nobody really understood it. Nobody really had the words for that. And I think that also allowed me to understand people who operate and behave in ways which are not, you know, as we understand as neurotypicals. And then I would say the second, probably most defining part of at least my youth, was I loved swimming, and for several years I was a competitive swimmer, and that really taught me the kind of discipline to not just get up at 4 a.m. and go to school and then go training again at 7 p.m., but how individual excellence, you know, when we were doing these competitions on the weekends, I individually had to be excellent, and how that individual excellence translates to our team success. And sometimes as well, when you're doing these relays, you know, you learn how to be a team player, not because you can speak to each other, because you're completely underwater. You know, you have to really sense your teammates and really, you know, be in tune with other people in different kinds of ways that you can't rely on the same sorts of things. And so I would say those were kind of the two most defining experiences that made me a good journalist before I'd even really kind of got to journalism. But I'd started in kind of the trends world because it was always a mixture of arts and culture and just meeting people and traveling. And I just wanted to talk to people and find a way to get paid for that, you know. You know, of course, yes, I'm a writer and I love writing, but for me, that was always the kind of the very last part. And I kind of moved into journalism because I was writing a lot of these really interesting reports about these interesting people creating some of the most innovative stuff, and then nobody was reading it. And so I moved into journalism because I was like, I want to still be doing that, but I want my stuff to be read. I want these people to be known and understood and these stories to come out. And so I kind of went through a phase of, you know, digital nomading for a while, and then moved to Berlin. And then as a freelancer, you just learn how to do a bunch of different things and pull them together.
What is your vision for European journalism? What are you seeing in the field of European journalism at the moment? What's happening?
Well, I would say, let's start with my vision, and then we can work our way back.
Good.
My vision would be a series of networked, collaborative, independent, local media hubs that report on their local communities and also work together across the continent. I think it should be low barrier to entry. I think that journalism in and of itself is a trade, and I don't believe that people need to go to big expensive schools and be in capital cities or do any of those kinds of things to be able to report on the people that they care about and the communities that they care about.
You also hear it happening a lot, right? That news deserts are even happening in Europe. So there's big areas that are not being served by journalism, local journalism, even in a continent as densely populated as Europe. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that's happening? Why is all the journalism centralizing, moving to the big cities, and how can we actually counter that?
I think it's, of course, a space in which only certain kinds of people have been able to access. I was lucky enough to have the privilege of growing up in London. I also grew up during Labour time. I don't come from money, but I was able to access certain kinds of opportunities, and I was able to go to university because there were certain types of financial aid that was open to me. I also got a scholarship for my master's. And when I graduated, and I was lucky enough to get a job at The Guardian, which, you know, at the time was very much my dream job, what I found was I was pretty much one of the only types of people in those spaces, not just The Guardian, but also Condé Nast and other types of big publications that were centralized in London. And the kinds of stories that I would be pitching or that I would hear others like me who found their way into those spaces weren't really taken seriously, and they would have, like most of the editors during that time, would rather have sent someone who knew nothing about those communities. And that was kind of my first experience of parachute journalism, essentially. But you're taught as well, you know, I spent a lot of time as a freelance journalist, and the way to have any pitch accepted is by really explaining why you're the person to tell that story. That doesn't really happen in, you know, big, large journalism, legacy media buildings. And I remember one example, actually. So I live in Berlin, in Germany now, well, over the last 6 years. And through kind of freelance journalism communities, we have really built quite a big network of particularly English language and English speaking journalists that write about all kinds of things across Europe. And there was one moment just before the pandemic where they had sent, The Guardian had sent a journalist, a middle-aged man, sent him to Berlin for one night to write about Berlin club culture, and then sent him back. And it wasn't a very good piece, not because that person wasn't a very good writer, but because it lacked all nuance of what Berlin club culture was really like, at least at the time. And it just felt like such a wasted opportunity to send someone from London to Berlin when there was a huge community of freelance journalists who were writing about club culture in Berlin, and several of them who had already written for The Guardian before. And it was really that was one of the moments where I just thought, this isn't working, and there's so much potential with the kinds of people that are already in the local communities, and yet the power is still centralized in places like London or Brussels or even Paris. And outside of that, when I left London, and I really left, you know, I'm from London, and before anything, I'm a Londoner. And it was really quite hurtful and a really quite sad decision that I made, because the London that I grew up in felt like the center of the world, you know? At least the neighborhood I grew up in, you know, the neighbors on my right-hand side were from Poland. The neighbors on my left-hand side were from Pakistan. The neighbors in front of me were from Vietnam. The neighbors on the side of them were from Somalia, and on the other side from Afghanistan. So kind of having this really mixed world space was all I ever really knew. And to then have worked quite hard and been lucky enough to access certain kinds of opportunities, to then be in a space where I wanted to write about the world and report on the world, I was then in a space where editors were only interested in writing about other people like themselves. And it's sort of this really interesting feeling when you finally get into those spaces and you realize, oh, I'm the only person here that didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge or has an inheritance or 2 family holiday homes. And that's a real shame. And I really left because I wanted to still be part of that. And I felt like London, and you know, is also so much more insular than the UK, but post-Brexit, it became even more insular. And when I left, there were so many people said to me, this is the stupidest thing you could be doing right now. And, you know, you've just started your media career in London. Surely this is the best it's ever going to get. And it was really hard for a really long time because the European media scene is so, it's not very well connected. They're not connected to each other. And I feel like finally after 6 years, we're starting to see those working together in a way that is far more exciting than anything that is happening in the UK or the US or Brussels, for example.
How can we, using journalism and media creative industries, make the concept of Europe a little bit more exciting to people, or if that's even needed? And how can, for instance, club culture or artists, musicians, how can we sort of collaborate across different trades, different media formats, different ways of expressing ourselves in order to make the stories about Europe or the stories we're telling to other people a bit more exciting?
Mm-hmm. I very much grew up with the privilege of being part of the EU project, and it's, you know, the classic thing of when you don't have it, you realize how important it is. And for me, I think there's a real opportunity to have a continental identity that goes past the EU project. And I'm not saying that it's not valuable. I'm just saying that there is so much more that is happening. And it's not just about what we do within the continent and how we speak to each other within the continent, but there's a real kind of need, I think, moving forward, especially what's happening globally. Like, what is Europe's identity and how does that look to the rest of the world? You know, we've been talking to each other for so long, but what does it look like, you know, from a global perspective? And I think that there's a lot more interest now in redistributing different types of power, not just an intentional approach. Like, of course, there are things that are happening that are not so positive. But I also think that young people are really frustrated now of having to force themselves into capital cities where they are unhappy, where they cannot afford to live, where they cannot afford to eat, just to have scraps of things that aren't really made for them. And why should people be leaving Naples when actually Naples needs more people than ever to stay there? And we've seen this a lot actually in Poland, where historically lots of the young people would leave Poland, study elsewhere, and then stay there. There's been a real shift in most of them coming back and actually really thinking about the ways in which they're going to change their country and what that could look like for the future.
So I want to go back to what we spoke about before, which is this idea of these centralized places in Europe where journalism is made, where media is made, and how we can sort of counter that or work towards a more spread out, democratic, equalized media landscape across Europe. Why do you think that decentralizing and using more localized European journalism hubs or media outlets, how would that benefit us as Europeans in sort of our storytelling, our news gathering, all those things?
Well, I think it's no surprise that people just don't like reading the news anymore. And what is our role as journalists in you know, building that civic engagement through our stories? And it's, for me at least, it's very much a, why should I, you know, what is journalism if nobody's reading it? Or if nobody's watching it, or if nobody's consuming it, you know? The ways in which you get people to read something is by having the kind of insight that they wouldn't have themselves. And the best stories are written by the kinds of people who have spent time really researching or integrating themselves in the community, in the story, in the, you know, in the war, whatever it is that they're reporting on. How can I have this one insight into something that I would never be able to access? That makes for a much more compelling story. And over decades and decades of parachute journalism and of putting journalists sitting in offices where, you know, journalism doesn't happen in an office, we are churning out more and more stories that aren't interesting, aren't insightful, and aren't relatable. So the only way in which to improve that is by having people who really know the story, who really know the community, and who aren't sitting in an office. And for me, the best solution to that is by redistributing our centers of where journalism happens, and also localizing it so that we're using people who, you know, didn't go to Oxford or Harvard or have 3 degrees or any of that, but who know how to, you know, have this insight into their communities. And it's the job of the editor to put it together in a way in which the readers can understand. It doesn't matter necessarily that these are, you know, hyper-trained journalists. And there's a really amazing project that that goes into places in which you can't access, whether through war or, for example, during the pandemic, and they remotely train citizen journalists to report on that. That project was so successful that they no longer send their journalists to those places. And I really think that there are different ways in which we can pull journalism back to its original space, which is about someone who translates and spreads a message through different kinds of stories. And we don't need to formalize that. We just need to be on the ground with the communities that are doing it. And there are, you know, and it wasn't that long ago, really, okay, a few decades, but it really wasn't that long ago, where people would leave school and go straight into a local newsroom and train there.
Yeah. If we talk about designing or working towards a more inclusive and a more democratic and a more accessible media landscape, what are your thoughts on these pillars of a more inclusive European media space or more accessible European media space and how we can go about that?
Yeah, so one of our main missions is by 2030 to have helped facilitate and set up an independent media hub, at least one in every country. So that would be 44 independent media hubs in Europe, and we've done 8 so far and proven that that's worked. And the pillars of that are really about how do we bring in experts to come in and round up the local journalists, local creatives, local media entrepreneurs, to bring in their different perspectives, their different skill sets, and pull them together in a way so they learn how to collaborate and give them the framework to be reporting on the stories that they know best. How do we do that and then scale that across Europe? And I think we have now built a model in which that works and is evidenced. And I think the next stage is really to help them start connecting with each other. And this idea of, you know, building a wave in which you take everyone with you as opposed to everyone fighting for the same piece of bread in London and Brussels and Paris, which we know just doesn't work, and it doesn't make for better reporting, and it doesn't make for more interesting people either. And I've been saying this for years, I think as well, that when you're in this kind of hyper-capitalist framework in these capital cities, you are pushed through a system in which, okay, I'm going to start as a junior, and what I really want is this editor job, but I have to pay my dues and I have to sit there for 20 years until I can get that role. And so what you've done over 20 years is the exact same thing for 20 years. And by the time you've got that job, you've already known how to do it for at least a decade. And what are you bringing to the table as an editor in that position? Nothing but 20 years of experience sitting in the same office. I would much rather hire someone who is, you know, maybe not polished around the edges or doesn't have, the right kind of legacy experience, but has lived in 10 countries or speaks 5 languages or, scuba dives on the side or any of those things. Like, those are the kinds of things that there is always an opportunity in which someone's personal experience comes together for a really interesting piece. And it's much better to spend your 20s going and doing all of that before forcing yourself into an office chair in a big legacy newsroom to robotically do the same thing for another 10 years until you finally get the editor job you've always known how to do. And I think that's why it's really important for young journalists to explore these sort of non-traditional career paths. But I also think it's really important to not take the first no, only in professional context, of course, but really think about how can you be ready for those opportunities and how can you create your own luck when that happens. And so, for example, when I did my master's in journalism, that course was really designed for people who had never done journalism before. We had an archaeologist, a fine artist, a photographer, and so they went on and actually became journalists writing about the topics that they were really interested in. But because I had gone to this master's after some years already working in industry, I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do. However, we did have a module in which we had to do an internship. And because I'd already done a whole bunch of internships before and I'd already worked in industry, my whole thing was like, I don't want to, just spend a couple of weeks doing things that I already know. Let me try and challenge myself and put myself in spaces that I've only ever dreamed about. And so I applied for The Guardian and I applied for The New York Times, not really expecting much. But I had read about the 6 degrees of separation theory a couple of years back, and I remembered that when I was sort of waiting to hear back from these applications. And so I went into my LinkedIn network, and because I had gone freelance very early, I didn't really have any contacts, not from my sort of family background or anything, or, just career experience. And so I went through my LinkedIn, and I found one of my old clients who was running an event, and on the website it had listed the New York Times as a media partner. And so I called him and I said, hey, who do you know at the New York Times, and can I speak to them? And so I managed to get a 1-week internship at the New York Times in London, and I was put into the T brand studio, so their branded content studio. And I remember at the time there was so much discourse around whether branded content is real journalism and all of this stuff, but that was such an amazing week because I got an insight in how to do that really well, and actually removed any sense of sort of any ego that I had about it, not just myself, but also the kind of discourse in the journalism community at the time. And I remember this one piece, and I was sitting on a table, and it was writers and editors and advertising executives and coders and developers, and they, in 1 week, produced this story, which, was very visually beautiful, but seemed quite simple, and it was sponsored by one of those smart home companies. And the story was about how modern homes burn quicker than previous homes because we have more synthetic materials in our home.
Burn down.
Yeah, they burn much faster than the sort of fire services can get to you, which, isn't the most thrilling of stories, but actually a very useful story for people to know. And that's kind of, in the space between journalism as a public good and informative and telling you stories that, you probably wouldn't like to spend your spare time doing. And I remember I got to the end of the story, and they had calculated just how long it would take for the average reader to get down to the end of the story, which was something like 23 minutes. And the last line said something like, in the time that it's taken for you to read this story, your home would have already burnt down. And this is what I mean in terms of really thinking about something creatively or coming from a creative space, even if what you're doing at the end may on the surface seem boring. And that was really something that I took with me through my journalism career so far. And then for the second internship, so we had to do 2 weeks, I managed to get that 1 week at the New York Times. And then for the second one, I hadn't heard back from The Guardian. And I knew, summer holidays were going to be really full of applications, but it was something like, March. And I went through my LinkedIn again, and I was like, there's got to be someone somewhere that knows someone at The Guardian. And one of the guys who ran this really interesting Futures magazine, one of the very first places that I had cold pitched to and wrote a piece for, he'd written a small news piece for The Guardian and had posted it on his social media. And so I asked, how did you do that? And he said, actually, one of my friends from school is now the editor of G2. And so I said, hey, do you mind sharing the email? And I emailed them and said, hey, look, I've applied. I'm also friends with, we have a mutual connection in common. And instead of me coming in and, doing it on the summer holidays, I can come in next week while you're still available. And so I did. And because of their sort of labor policies, they only gave you 5 days because they couldn't pay at the time. And I remember on Thursday, I'd been given this task that had clearly been sort of, kind of thrown around the newsroom. And the week before was the Westminster terrorist attack in London, Westminster Bridge terrorist attack in London. And The Guardian wanted to profile some of the victims and, tell their stories and talk about their lives. And one of the last victims that they were trying to profile was an elderly man who was self-employed, unmarried, and certainly didn't have any social media accounts. And so, it was pretty much impossible. And I was sort of the third or fourth person that had been asked to find out something about this man so that they could give the info to a staff writer to write the story. But I managed to find one article that listed his name in a local newspaper that said he was part of a fishing group in Clapham in South London, and they would fish nearby Clapham Common. And I didn't live very far from Clapham at the time, and so I said to the editor, hey, do you mind if I just come in late on my last day? I live quite close to Clapham, and maybe I can find something. And so she let me go. And I woke up the next morning, and I went to Clapham, and I didn't know, what looked like a very difficult or near impossible task. I had one idea. And I had enough experience with death to know one thing. What do you think that is? What's the first thing people do when someone dies? Or one of the first things people do when someone dies?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Cry?
Well, yes, of course. When somebody dies, wherever it is, one of the first things that at least the community do is put flowers outside their door. So I went to Clapham Common and I looked around until I could find a door with flowers on it, and it was his door. And I came back to The Guardian later that afternoon with a list of 10 people to interview to write this profile about this victim. And so fast forward several months later, my deadline for my final piece for my master's was on a Sunday at midnight or something. And on the Friday afternoon before that, I got a call from that same editor who said, hey, Sabrina, our fixer is leaving, and I remember you did such a good job on the Westminster attacks, like profiling for the Westminster victims. Would you like the job, and can you start on Monday? And so I submitted my final piece of my master's on Sunday night, and on Monday morning I started at The Guardian. And that for me was really a moment of creative thinking and using your personal experiences in order to solve a problem. And I think that's something that is really, really overlooked. And again, a problem that was not solved by a journalist sitting in an office. And this kind of approach only comes from people with diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, or a diverse skill set that they've pulled and exercised through lots of different means. And I think when it comes to collaborative approaches to journalism, and when it comes to decentralized approaches to journalism, that's the kind of thing we really need to focus on.
Well, thank you, Sabrina, for telling us your story here at Close Up. Any final thing you want to add?
Good journalism happens together, not alone.